Thank you very much. And it is, as much as it was good to get away for a Sunday to do absolutely nothing except walk through the Tennessee hills with the leaves changing with Kelly. I'm seeing God's beautiful creation all around. I will admit, I think the landscape is prettier in Tennessee, but I don't think the people could be in your spirit. And it was good to get back home, and we're glad to be back here this morning as well. And I hope I don't confuse anybody, but I want to kind of pick up from the message that not last week, but 2 weeks ago. And this is kind of a continuation of one long sermon, if you will. When we began to talk about telling our story based on a true story, and this is kind of part 2. And if you weren't here, to get you up to date or see where we are, more specifically, we said that we need to view our story in the context of a continuation of God's story. And we established that our story, which we need to share with other people, is part of a greater story of God and how God works in the world in which we live. And we established that each of us have a story and a unique story. And each of our stories are important to not only to us, but to others as well, whether we believe that or not. And we forget at times that telling our story and words that we use of how we tell our story has power. And it has the power to build people up. And by telling our story, we have the ability to encourage and inspire and uplift others. But we also possess the same ability, even whether we're conscious of it or not, to tear people down when we share our stories. And just by the way we tell our stories, we can make someone's life begin to soar. Their self-worth takes off. And we can play a small part of them reaching their greatest potential in life. Or we can kind of do just the opposite. And I want us to all realize we need to tell our story. It is part of God's bigger story. But we also need to be aware of how we tell our story. And in the process, I hope I can debunk some of the myths that maybe we carry in our mind or we have heard about telling our story as well. And the first myth is our story has to be disastrous or painful or heartbreaking to be worth telling. It's simply not true. It's not the truth at all. Last weekend, Kelly and I went and saw a movie alone. Just the two of us. And that happened in like forever. And we went and saw a movie, and I don't like to use movies in the message, but we went and saw the movie The Judge. I don't know if you've seen advertisements. It's a good movie. I don't want to no spoiler alert here, but the movie is about a very complicated, messy, estranged father and son relationship. And how this one event that happened in this boy's youth resurfaces years later as adults. And it all comes out. And they're focused in this setting to deal with these things. And as I watched and ate my popcorn, and I watched this unfold on the screen, it reminded me of the great relationship I had with my father. It reminded me of the great relationship I had with my father-in-law. And with my dad, we were close. I mean, it was loving, it was nurturing. But I realize now as an adult that my true story of my father-son relationship, it was a gift. It was a blessing. It was unique. And I realized a lot of people had not so good relationships with their fathers for whatever reasons. And I understood that a lot of people did not have good role models to emulate when they became fathers. But that shouldn't keep me from telling my story. I mean, it is okay to say, you know what? I don't know what it's like to have a crummy dad. I mean, my dad made mistakes, but overall, I can't imagine how painful that must have been. I can realize how scary that must have been for you growing up in a home where that wasn't so. Or being a father, especially being a good father when you had no role model. I get how hard that is to do. And I can say that without saying, I was lucky you were. A couple of weeks ago, I met a kid at the football field. And the orphans were practicing, and I was jogging, and I got finished before they did, and I was sitting on the bleachers just, trying not to pass out and be ready. And this kid comes up to me, and he says, "Pastor Tommy, do you remember me?" And I said, "No." And I didn't know if I knew him from coaching football. I didn't know where I knew this young man from. And he said, "I came to your church a couple of times with my dad and my stepmom." And then he proceeded to tell me his name and the connection, and I don't want to share it here. And I said, yes. Now it started coming back. Now I remember you came to Circle. You came to church a couple of times. I said, "Man, you've grown up. You were like this little kid, and now you're like this." I was like, and I said, "I haven't seen you or haven't seen your dad and your stepmom since they moved, away from Centralia." And then he said, "Yeah, my dad doesn't have anything to do with me." He says, "I've tried to visit him, but he told me he didn't want me to come. I guess he has a new family now." And I said, "I'm so sorry that you got hurt." And he said, "Yeah, you have no idea." And then I said, "You know what? I want you to know it's his loss. It's his loss. Because if I had a kid like you, I'd spend every minute I had with him." And that was it. And we sat there, it seemed like forever, just kind of staring off in space. No more conversation. No more, I had a good dad, that was it. But from that moment on, I have seen this kid over a dozen times at the football field. He helps out as a manager or something with the orphans. But each time I see him, he becomes my shadow. He never leaves me. And our story doesn't have to be a bad one to share. See, we can empathize and we can show compassion to others even when our story is not tragic. And although many of us have tragic stories in our lives just as well, and they need to be told. And the things about stories that we must remember as we share is found in this letter that the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome. And if you want to take an example out of the Bible of someone who really knew how to tell his story and put it in the context of God's story, it's the Apostle Paul. Paul gives you his story just straight out. The good, the bad, the ugly, everything. But he does it through a lens that illustrates how God was working in his life the entire time. Even when he couldn't see it. Paul was the persecutor of the church. He killed Christians. That was his job. But he tells his story in a way. And if you turn to me, this is his advice. If you can turn to me to the 3rd chapter of Romans, in this letter that he writes to the church in Rome, beginning with the 23rd verse. This is what Paul writes. He says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ." Paul reminds us of our myth number 2, is that we have to always be the hero of our own story. That's not true. It sounds good, I went to school and I walked 4 miles both ways uphill in 10 feet of snow, and I never complained. It sounds good. Okay, maybe it was tough walking to school, and yes, maybe you didn't want to or like walking to school, but was it really that difficult? I don't know. There's a guy that I grew up with, and went to high school, junior high or high school with, who is now not laugh, but who is now a pretty famous rapper. Not like candy rapper, but like, rapper. But in his stories and in his bios that I've read, that it states, and I'm going to quote this, he used his linguistic skills to narrowly escape the crime and violence of the streets of Memphis, Tennessee, and the constant threat of gang violence. That's what it says. Okay. We had crime in our neighborhood, okay, but the only violence that we grew up in, that he grew up in, was maybe a 2-second wrestling match to the ground, or a fight over a girl, or an argument of who got out and kicked ball. The only gang in our neighborhood was a bunch of us who played wiffle ball in the streets, and one had to watch out for the cars to stop, and that was it. But I guess his version, or his record label's version, is a lot better. But it doesn't give an accurate depiction. And Paul reminds us that, look, we're not heroes. None of us are heroes. Paul reminds us that all of us, every one of us are broken. Every one of us are sinners. And there are heroic things that we've done in our life. Yes, they are. But Paul reminds us that we are all justified freely by Christ's grace. If you think about it for a second, Jesus' followers, those disciples who kind of gave up everything to follow him, they weren't the prettiest. They weren't the most popular. They weren't the smartest people in the world. They didn't have horrible stories to tell. Most of the people that gave up everything and followed Jesus, they achieved some stuff, but basically they were hardworking people that just kind of were trying to bang out living every day, for themselves and their families. And then here comes Jesus. And Jesus comes, and they knew without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was a God guy. They knew from the moment they met him that this is a God guy. This is a holy guy. There's something different about this guy that's not like any other person we see. But see, they were taught their entire lives. They were taught that if they were good enough, if they behaved well enough, then they would get the favor of God. And there's this Jesus story that I love, that Jesus went to Levi's house, and Levi was a tax collector, and those following Jesus said, Jesus, no, you need to come to our house. Not his house, you need to come to. We're not tax collectors. Look, our life is not a hot mess. We don't cheat people. You don't go to his, come to our house. We've earned, Jesus, we have earned the right. We've been good. We've earned the right for you to come hang out with us. Jesus said, I didn't come to hang out with you. And the problem of Jesus' followers was Jesus was hanging out with the people who had not achieved something yet in their eyes. But Jesus didn't say to the bad people, you're a horrible person. He didn't say your life is a mess. He didn't say, you made some really dumb mistakes in your life. No. We've all done that. Jesus says, no. Jesus said, I didn't say that because most people already knew that. I don't have to tell them that. Jesus said, they know their life is a mess. They know they've made mistakes. He said, but people whose life is not a mess already know that also. So we as Jesus' followers, we don't need to remind them of that. And Jesus says, here's what is good in life. He says, this good thing, it's a relationship with God. He said, this good thing is here for you too if you want it. That's what he's saying to these people. But here's the thing, it's given freely. It's given freely. You see, none of us, all of us are sinners. None of us can earn it or achieve God's approval or Jesus' approval. But we can receive God's approval. And so it brings us to our third and last myth. That our story is better or worse in the eyes of God than the next person's. That's not true either. You see, when God's grace is given freely, sometimes we tend to adopt the attitude that I don't do that, or I don't do what they do, but I want what they have. You know, I want what they have, but I don't do what they do. And I don't do the bad stuff they do, God, but I want the same grace. I want the same favor of God that they have. I mean, the thing about bad people, and people that are struggling in this life, I found in their redemption stories, when they begin to tell you their story of where they were and where they are now, they are honest. It's authentic. They're real about their feelings. They are real about their shortcomings. They are honest about their failures. And they still have a close relationship with God. Because a real relationship with God or anyone is a relationship. It's not a resume. I mean, that's what we do sometimes. Sometimes we make it like a resume. God, I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this, and I didn't do this, so will you hire me? I mean, will you love me? Will you let me in your kingdom? In people's redemption stories, don't worry about that. They don't worry about what God thinks about them today. You know why? Because they've had a horrible mess before. And they were really bad a long time ago. And if God loved them then, He surely loves them on a day-to-day basis. And now. And Jesus says, look, I didn't come for the healthy. Let that sink in. Jesus says, I didn't come for the healthy. I mean, you don't go to the doctor and say, Doc, you need to see me first. I know there's a lot of sick people out there in your waiting room, but, I've been coming to you for 20 years, and I've paid my bills on time, and, I just want you to know, I know there's a lot of people out there, but I want you to have to spend time with me, and I want you to see how healthy I am. It seems absurd, but that's sometimes what we do with God. Or this. If you have ever had a sibling that was always in trouble, and they've always got every bit of your parents' attention, is that fair? No, it's not fair. It wasn't fair. But have you ever thought for a second that your parents didn't have to worry about you? Did you ever think for a second that they were entrusting with you, that you were their true blessing? You see, our story can be about being a blessing. Telling our story is not about, look what I can do or how great my life is. No. It's so far from that. It's saying, I can't imagine what you're going through. I mean, my parents never were divorced. My dad never did move away. But I know if that did happen to me, I know how painful, confusing, and scary that is for a 14-year-old boy. I mean, blessing stories are filled with empathy. They're filled with compassion. They're filled with understanding. And they are rid of any slight hint of judgment. People that got it all together need Jesus just as much as people that don't have it all together. But the difference is that for some of us, we're trying to achieve something that is meant to be received. It's impossible. It's impossible to achieve what is meant to be received. You can't earn it. You can't buy. You can't wait to obtain something that is given away freely. Think about that for a second. It's impossible. But we've messed up somewhere if we can't lend mercy to those who need to hear it. Because our story is part of God's story. And an untold story helps no one. Will you pray with me?